So, all right, this is the title of the topic, and I'm going to pull it up right now. All right, in-office anesthesia for rhinology procedures. Not clearly as fun and engaging, perhaps, as what we were just talking about, but this is the reality, the nuts and bolts. Like, how do we get that Google 5-star review of doing challenging things, painful things on our patients? And before I get into one story, let me just pitch one more time otolaryngology underwater, folks. Join me in Jamaica in October, so hope to see you there. All right, moving on. So if it hurts, you're not going to get the Google 5-star review. And in fact, like the one time a patient made a serious complaint against me was when I was doing what I thought was the best way to numb up the nose before an in-office nasal procedure. And it was basically blocking V1, V2 from the glabella down the side of the nose and intraoral injections. And she didn't like it. She was 80 years old and thought I was, quote, trying to kill her. Not the case. I was not trying to kill her. But it made me think, and it made me go back and literally look at Netter. I'm like, what am I missing? And then I was talking to one of my friends, David Sauter over in Spokane, at Spokane ENT, and he's like, I use this Tetracaine stuff. And I'm like, all right, I've heard about the Tetracaine Gel. Maybe I should try it. So I talked to without naming names, I talked to one of the pharmacies that's here in the fishbowl, and I said, hey, I want to try the Tetracaine Gel. He's like, well, it's not just Tetracaine Gel, it's this Tetracaine Pleuronic Gel. And what that means is it comes in a solid form at room temperature and body temperature, but when you put it in the refrigerator, it liquefies. Okay, so it's liquid, which means you can inject it into a space, into the nose, and then as soon as it hits body temperature, it forms a solid gel. So let me show you this. Before a patient comes in, I'm going to have them take Tylenol. I'm going to have them use Afrin Spray because I want the nose decongested. And then when they get there, my medical assistant is going to spray the standard Afrin lidocaine spray. And then he's going to put in 4% lidocaine-soaked 1/2x3 cottonoids just in the anterior nasal cavity. And this doesn't matter if I'm doing a nasal valve procedure with Vivere, if I'm doing a posterior nasal nerve ablation, if I'm doing balloon dilation. It's kind of the same anesthetic technique. And then 5 to 10 minutes later, I walk in and I'm going to infuse this Tetracaine Gel. It's been in the refrigerator for 30 minutes. I'm just going to squirt it wherever it needs to go, and then I'm going to walk away for 15 minutes, go see another patient, and then come back. So this is what it looks like. This is a strange metal applicator that I found in like our junk drawer, but it works great. It's blunt, so it's not sharp. And I'm going in the left middle meatus here, and you can see it just squirts the gel, and it comes out in a firm gel versus if you're going to use the standard 10% Tetracaine Gel, that stuff is going to slip right down the nasopharynx, and the patient's going to swallow it and spit it out. Then the downside is you got to go back in and suction it out. It's so thick, they can't blow. They'll blow and blow and blow their nose, but nothing comes out. So this is just a picture of what it looks like. So,
Dr. Davis, just to interrupt, could you sinus rinse? Could you ask them to sinus rinse?
Yes, so I have thought about doing a sinus rinse to help get this stuff out afterwards. I have not done it yet, but then I'm having to get the sinus rinse bottle. I'm having to mix up the saline for them, and so it's, I think, time consuming, easier for me just to suction it out. But I do think that would work. So the question to the other faculty, this is just one way of numbing up the nose. If you haven't used Tetracaine Pleuronic Gel, and it's a 10%, 20% mixture, I want you to ask the compounding pharmacies in the fishbowl tomorrow if you can try it. And I think it's going to change your patient satisfaction. And I always like to come together at this course and say, all right, what have you learned in the last year? This is the biggest thing I've learned in the last year is how to numb up the nose better and get more 5-star reviews. So whoever has a microphone, Dr. Onstead, do you have a microphone still? Oh, no. What do we do up in Canada? Dr. Jadua.
I still use topical sprays, so I'll inject the nose with lidocaine, a spray which has Motrin in it as well, and then I'll inject. If I really want it to be non-knowledge.
All right, so the issue, who injects the nose for in-office procedures? Anybody who doesn't inject? Yeah, myself, yeah. it's blood. Like, patients don't like it. And not just a marketing thing, but if you tell the patient, look, I can do what I need to do. It doesn't matter if it's balloon dilation or not. I don't need to inject your nose, and then there's no bleeding, and they're much happier. They don't taste that blood.
So, Greg, we actually...
Do you have a microphone back there that's on, maybe? Even better?
About 6 to 7 years ago, we went to a directional sprayer. It's this, I don't know how much it costs, but... Well, the mic's not working, so I'll just talk real loud because I'm used to it. All right, so basically it's a directional sprayer that you can point and direct anywhere in the sinuses. It's actually our standard sprayer now, and it actually makes a great way to spray the nose for any like endoscopy, endoscopic debridement. You can actually direct it up into the frontal sinus. You can direct it out into the maxillary. So, when you're sucking out some of the blood from the maxillary, it tends to pull on their teeth and whatnot. It's great because you can just put it around the corner and do the Tetracaine spray, and it helps kind of settle in there. You go to another patient, come back, their teeth are numb, and it's perfect. I love that technique. It's just a regular, I think it's 4% Tetracaine, and we use that little directional sprayer.
Do you know what the sprayer is? Is it one of the MAD devices?
What I'll do is let me text my assistant, and maybe they can send
get back to us tomorrow.
Yeah.
When you say directional sprayer, do you just mean that the tip of the nozzle is bendable?
Yeah, it's very malleable.
I have a picture tomorrow.
Yeah, it's very malleable, and it's an excellent way to kind of get around corners and really provide very good local anesthesia. Yeah.
Dr. Humphreys, since you're next to Dr. Woodworth, anything that you would do different?
I don't think I could get that approved in our clinic because of the atomization or aerosolization. They still keep us constrained about anything that's aerosolizing.
So it's actually not atomization, and that's the thing with the old spray, right? You'd put it on, it would do that, and you put it on, and it would be this big mist and everything. That thing actually doesn't distribute as well as you think it would. With this, you can actually do very good directional spraying in the sinuses. So you could just do like a regular spray on the turbinate, and then you can bring it around the corners and direct to some of those areas where you're going to do the procedure.
I agree. I have the same kind of sprayer thing I'm using this mic. I think it's working. That you can do it. The hardest part is you're putting it directly inside the sinus cavities, and so each of those tops have to be changed out, sterilized. It's the only problem I have with it. I'll show a picture tomorrow in the post-op debridement talk.
Well, there you go.
Dr. Rains. And then we'll get back to Dr. Humphreys.
Go ahead. Sorry, from an English point of view, I do a lot of children just cauterizing nose. You use Kofanikin spray. Do you have access to that here?
Kofanikin spray?
Yeah, just basically a little bottle in it. You spray it in. Or put it on cotton wool and just leave it for a few minutes. It'll disperse into everything.
And is it cocaine based?
No, Kofanikin. It's a lidocaine type of process. Yeah. I wish you.
I'm not aware of it
I was
in the
brought up
US.
with cocaine, 25% cocaine paste, and your patients went home happy. They really did.
All right, Ian, back to you. What do you do? Because you got residents that are banging the scope. Maybe not these residents, but you got residents that get creative with the endoscope and where they put it. What do you do to keep your patients happy?
It's not as sophisticated or sexy as that's been said. It's 4% lidocaine on cotton pledgets, half-by-3s, as you alluded to, very similar, and an injection of 1% with usually along the middle turbinate attachment to the posterior lateral nasal wall for anything middle meatal. If it's going to be inferior turbinate, plus or minus an injection in the inferior turbinate. I think there is some discussion for inferior turbinate, using it as a tumescent versus a constrictor, so I think about that as well, too.
All right, any faculty members have something keen to add to this? Yes, Dr. Preek, what do you do with these little kids squirming around?
I agree with Dr. Rain. I think that topical 4% lidocaine on a pledget is extremely effective. I'll put that in the nose and I walk out, go see my next patient, come back, and it just permeates the area when I'm doing cauterization. And I might shock you, but for all my flexible fiber optic evaluation in children, I give nothing. I don't think it makes a difference. And there's some studies that suggest that too. I'm not going to quote the p-value on that, but My own experience, the first 10 years of practice, I topicalized everyone before doing flexible fiber optic. The last 15 years I stopped, and I don't think it makes a shoe of difference for doing fiber optic evaluation of the airway.
You mean from a pain standpoint? Do you also
pain,
find that from a
irritation.
congestion standpoint? Like I do it to decongest the nose so I can see into the middle.
No, I mean, most of the time I'm going through the nose to get to the larynx, but I just don't, I don't think for fiber optic children, I don't think it makes a difference. So I agree with Professor Rain here about some of his suggestions.
Now, what about, Sanjay, if you are doing a debridement in a pediatric patient post-op? Or
Yeah.
do you even do debridements?
No, I don't do debridement in children. You know, I think that there's some evidence, loose evidence that suggests there's no difference in outcomes in children with or without debridement for CRS outcomes. So I haven't done it for a long time. For me, it's going to require a trip to the OR to do a really decent debridement, and so I'm like, I'm not going to do that. I'll just do saline, low pressure, high volume saline. By the way, good luck with that on a child to get that going.
No, I asked because now that I get to see kids again, now that I'm in private practice, I do occasionally take them back to the OR for the debridement, and it's the thing that I haven't figured out is in the adult population or the teen population, there's a 10 to 20% chance of a sneaky eye, a small little one. And it takes you 30 seconds to lyse that sneaky eye. But are we missing that in the pediatric population if we're not doing a debridement? And certainly we've all seen kids who have had surgery and they're low teens and they come back and there's a lateralized middle turbinate, things like that. So I wonder what the ROI is for taking every pediatric sinus surgery patient back to the OR for a debridement versus just taking care of it down the road if it becomes a problem.
I mean, I think you point to maybe the revision rates are higher in children than adults for that reason. So, I mean, I tell, I'm sure all you guys do the same thing. It's a relationship, right? It's not a one and done. So everyone gets counseled if you're a child and we're heading, and by the way, I'm doing way less sinus surgery than I ever have in my career. The Trikafta for cystic fibrosis, super effective. Antibiotics, all the, they stop with steroids, very effective. And so, but when we do it, it's a relationship that I don't think children, it's a one and done. It's seldom the case that I'm able to cure someone with surgery alone.
All right. So for the last 5 minutes of the afternoon, Dr. Jandro, if you could be Phil Donahue and carry the mic around. What I want to do is open it up for any questions of anything you saw today. I don't want to wait until tomorrow. We'll talk about biologics and polyps and things like that tomorrow. Feel free to ask tonight. But is there something that came up in any of the lectures, pro sections, that you just got to ask before you forget about that? Raise your hand, and it's open mic time.
I think this is particularly useful because what you see is that the interactivity and the candid opinions you're getting, take advantage of these both from a surgical perspective or from anything that just didn't make sense from the talks that happened today. Pretty good group to give you real world answers. You have a question? Okay.
I was actually, I'm sorry, I'm still back on the Tetracaine thing. Because, when I'm hearing like, oh, I'd like to use lidocaine and everything, I was just doing a little evidence-based stuff with some p-values and randomized controlled trial.
I like p-values.
Yeah, randomized controlled trial back in 1995 shows Tetracaine is far superior for mucosal anesthesia than lidocaine. So, just FYI.
Do you have a confidence interval on that, by the way? All right.
So my question is about insurance reimbursement and pre-op protocols and such. So assuming you've got a patient coming in, how do you navigate and how do you plan preoperatively managing, the insurance indications versus what you think is going to be best for that patient, assuming that, they're coming in, they're frustrated, they've had multiple courses of antibiotics, or maybe they haven't, but they're really frustrated with their sinus symptoms, and you think surgery may be on the horizon for a certain person.
So I love, Kate, that's a great question. And I love seeing Dr. Manis just slump and sink and think like, oh boy, because he's on our 3P committee. My opinion, again, going from academics to private practice, we are at the mercy of the insurance company, as frustrating as it is. We know, there's payers, if you don't get a CT scan within 30 days of a post-treatment CT scan, that surgery is not going to get approved unless they have a mass or something like that, polyps. So there's a point where you just have to, the difference is if you unfortunately know those policies up front, then you can kind of incorporate that into your medical practice, as opposed to being naive about those policies which most, admittedly, I was and still am for some policies, and then submitting the insurance authorization for surgery, and then getting the denial, and then having to go back and jump through the hoops. So as painful as it is, I would, at this point in time, encourage you to learn those policies. Dr. Manis, anything you can do?
I would agree with that. And then the only thing I would say is, and it depends on the day, like how ornery I'm going to be about it with an insurance company. And I had one recently where I was pretty ornery, and I was describing it to the patient, and I told him, like, look, this surgery is not going to happen. And here was the conversation that I had. And I've had a few of these conversations, and I'm always willing to argue. I know it's not going to make a difference because, they'll say, well, this is the policy. And I'll say, well, this is why the policy's incorrect. And then they'll say, well, there's nothing that I can do. And I'll say, well, actually, there is something that you can do. You're just opting not to do something, and that's your choice, and that's fine. Thank you very much for nothing. But as I recount this conversation to the patient, every time they will say to me, hey, thanks for sticking up for me, or thanks. And I found that those are some of the patients with whom I have some of the best relationships with. And so I'll tell them, like, look, these are the things that we have to do. And we have to play this game, and it just is what it is, and it's just like anything else in life. And I'm sorry. But I think educating yourself about it up front, and also then a lot of times people come to you and they may have had a bunch of things done already, and trying to get as much information about that and throwing it in there can be very helpful, because they're really just looking for buzzwords. That's it. They're looking for a trial of this. They're looking for time of this. They're looking for numbers of this. If you can figure out what that is, and if it's happened, just make sure you state it.
I've also found educating your radiologists, and obviously it's many radiologists, but I'm sure we've all had denials like, well, the radiology report doesn't say there's any mucosal thickening in the sphenoid sinus. And you're looking at the scan like, yeah, there is. There's quite a bit. So I will take the time to try to educate the radiologist, but also cut and paste. I actually learned this from Ian Humphreys, to cut and paste a couple of the key images from the CT scan, because when you're doing the peer-to-peer, you're going to ask them, do you have my note in front of you? And they're 9 times out of 10 going to say, no, I don't have your notes in front of me. I'm like, well, that's a problem. But if they do have your note in front of them, I'll say, look at that CT scan. You see the mucosal edema? Oh, yeah, I see it. Okay, it's approved now. So it is worth doing the peer-to-peer, as painful as it is. Anyway, that's yes. Or you could all move to Canada. You don't have a problem with billing, but the access to surgical care is another issue. Yeah. Arif?
No.
Anything? Nothing. Okay, so we are at our witching hour.